Have you ever felt like you were born into the background, expected to stay quiet, grateful, invisible, while others were handed crowns you weren't allowed to touch? This story is for every girl who was told to be thankful for the silence when all she ever wanted was the truth. The teacup trembled ever so slightly in my hands. Not enough to spill, enough to be noticed. The room was steeped in muted grandeur. Ivory walls glowing under the chandelier's filtered light, polished floors so reflective they doubled every movement in solemn silence. A long walnut table stretched like an accusation down the center of the tea room, its lace runners ironed to precise perfection. Porcelain cups with painted lotus flowers sat untouched, waiting for hands that didn't labor for them. I stood at the head of the table, clutching the silver tray, the weight of 11 hand-glazed cups balanced by muscle memory and practiced invisibility. Across from me, Yeren leaned back into her chair like it was a throne she inherited rather than earned, the hem of her powder-pink dress brushing against the leg of a housemaid who scurried to adjust the curtain draw. "Look," she said with the same syrupy sharpness she used when greeting guests she hated, even the way she pours tea. Like a servant reenacting a role in a period drama. How poetic. A soft chorus of polite laughter followed, feigned and brittle. Even Aunt Sora gave a smile so thin it looked painted on. I bowed my head and stepped back, letting the tray rest against my hip as I filled her cup. One tilt of the wrist, steam rising, her perfume curling into my throat like jasmine set on fire. My fingers were steady, but she saw it anyway. The slight tremor, the barest clink of porcelain. She grinned. "You might want to take smaller steps next time," she murmured as she raised the cup to her lips. "One drop on grandmother's carpet and you'll get exiled to the laundry wing." The words weren't a joke, though she said them like one. My gaze flickered toward the carpet beneath her feet, an antique import from Venice, cream-colored and embroidered with cranes. A stain would not be forgiven. I've cleaned that rug on my knees before. I know every vine, every crane's wingtip. I know where one thread unravels, and I know who blamed me for it when it first frayed. I bowed again and turned toward the next guest, letting my eyes pass over the room, as if searching for my next mark, when in truth, I was cataloging the scene. Grandmother sat at the far end of the table, her spine a perfect line, her cane resting neatly at her side. She didn't speak, not yet, but her silence commanded more attention than any voice. Her eyes scanned the table with clinical coldness. When they passed over me, they didn't linger. They never did. She never once looked at me long enough to see the way I carry my tray like she holds her fan, in precise symmetry. Never long enough to wonder why my cheekbones mirror the woman above the fireplace, the one they call beloved, the one they erased. Above her throne-like chair hung the oil portrait gold-framed, solemn. A woman in cream hanbok with a red sash, her hands folded delicately in her lap. Her eyes watched the room with a softness that didn't belong in this house. I caught my own reflection in the silver tray again and saw what they refused to say aloud. With my mother's eyes on my face still here. "Don't linger," one of the housemaids whispered behind me as she passed, her tray held tight, back arched in perfect service posture. I nodded and stepped away. As I moved down the table, pouring tea for people who had never remembered my birthdays, I felt the heat creep up the back of my neck. I didn't belong at this table, not as a guest, not even as staff. I was something in between, something unspoken. They called me Mina's daughter, as if that explained everything. Mina, the housemaid who had been here longer than the wallpaper, the woman who tied my braids before school and stitched extra fabric into my uniforms when I outgrew them, the one who told me stories from books she could never afford but had memorized from her sister's shelf. But I wasn't Mina's daughter, and they knew it. They never questioned why my school fees were paid through the main estate account, or why, when I once had a fever so high I couldn't stand, grandmother's personal physician arrived before the staff doctor. They noticed. They simply never spoke. Silence was easier than truth. "Enough pouring. Sit," Yeren said suddenly, her voice loud enough to cut across the table. "She looks like she's about to faint from all the bowing." There was mock concern in her voice, a performance for the cousins, the wives, the aunts, a gesture so they could all say later she was kind enough to let her sit. Kind, as if mercy tastes sweet coming from the hand that fed me nothing for years. Still, I obeyed. I always did. I took the chair nearest the window, my back to the light so my face would be in shadow, and folded my hands in my lap. My uniform itched at the neck. The sleeves were tight again. Mina had said she'd let the seams out tonight. The tea steamed quietly in my cup. No one poured it for me. Across the room, grandmother finally stirred. "Who brewed the oolong today?" she asked. "You're in," someone said quickly. She picked the leaves herself. Lie. One I'd heard so many times it no longer stung. They wanted her to shine. I was only allowed to polish. Grandmother nodded once, satisfied. Her gaze never drifted toward me again. I wasn't in the family photo they took last winter. I'd been in the back, wiping the window pane so the snow would show behind them. I remember the click of the shutter. The way the laughter didn't include me. The way Yirin had pulled grandmother's shawl tighter around her shoulders like a crown. The table filled with talk of stocks and art, of vacation homes and brand deals. I sat and sipped, invisible once more, until a single drop of tea slipped down the outside of my cup and landed, soundlessly, on the white linen beneath it. I stared at the mark. A stain. Tiny. Unforgivable. The stain from the tea had faded by dinner, scrubbed from the linen before anyone noticed. I made sure of it. Yirin had laughed too loud that day, and that meant someone would have to bleed to balance the air. Back in the servants' quarters, the house fell into its usual hush, the kind that settled like damp wool on the skin. Upstairs, the Han family dined under crystal light and music from a grand piano that no one played well, but no one dared admit sounded hollow. Down here, the walls peeled softly near the floorboards, and the rooms smelled faintly of starch and citrus from the morning's ironing. I sat at the small table near the window, the rain tracing threads on the glass like veins. A single slice of cake rested on a chipped porcelain plate, plain sponge, no icing. No candle. No card. Mina, gently, from the doorway. "Eat before it gets cold. Don't make noise, they're still upstairs." Her voice was kind and tired, like it had walked too far and no longer trusted its own footsteps. She didn't wish me happy birthday. She never did. Neither of us said the word anymore. I nodded and picked up the silver spoon, the same one I'd used for 10 years. It had a small dent near the tip where someone dropped it long ago. I always checked to see if the dent was still there before I ate, as if I needed the reminder that nothing precious stayed whole in this house. No candles, no name written in icing, just that same spoon, passed down like I was. Nina moved quietly through the room, folding linens that didn't need folding, wiping counters already clean. Her movements had that rhythm of someone trying to keep their hands from remembering something. I let her pretend she had something to do. I let her pretend that this wasn't a birthday. The cake was dry. It clung to the roof of my mouth, each bite needing effort to swallow. I chewed without tasting. The room was too quiet, the way silence becomes sharp when it's covering something up. Across from me sat the old bookshelf, crooked from years of one missing screw. Mina's collection was there, mostly donated or discarded books from the children's wing, stories she used to read to me in hushed tones when the others slept, fairy tales where the forgotten girl always turned out to be royalty, cloaked in magic, destined for something more. I stopped believing in those endings a long time ago. Still, I got up and opened the lowest cabinet. Not the bookshelf, the cabinet beneath it. There was a gap in the back panel, barely noticeable unless you already knew where to press. My fingers found the crack and slipped through. The space behind it was dry, hidden from the house's storms. Inside it was a single album, leather-bound, worn, faded gold leaf initials on the front. I traced them without breathing. HS. I had found it 3 years ago, on a night much like this one, when the thunder drowned out the questions in my chest. Mina never spoke of what was behind that door. She had caught me looking once, and her eyes had filled with something so hollow it frightened me. She hadn't said a word, She just walked away and never mentioned it again. Tonight, I opened it again. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and old ink. Photographs, some fading, others sharp. Most were labeled in neat, looping handwriting. Sora's piano recital. Yerin, first tooth. Hyun, debate championship. Then, without a label, a photo fell loose and fluttered onto the floor. My hands moved before I could think. I picked it up carefully, as though it might vanish if I blinked. A woman, Rigo, composed, sat on the edge of a stone bench in the Han garden, her arms wrapped protectively around a child no older than 1. The child's cheeks were full, a faint smear of frosting near the mouth. The woman's gaze was soft, almost startled, as though someone had caught her in the act of feeling something too honest. My breath caught in my throat. It was her, the woman from the portrait above the fireplace, the one they called the firstborn, the one they never named anymore, the one I had memorized in oil paint, from the sharp jawline down to the eyes that always looked like they knew something the rest of the house had forgotten. Her hand rested against the child's small back. The child looked up at her with a kind of wild trust I couldn't remember ever feeling. And I recognized myself. The photo blurred. I didn't realize I was shaking until I felt the corners bend in my grip. I steadied my fingers. Her arms around me, her smile, like she wasn't afraid yet, like she still believed love was enough to change this place. I stared at her eyes, my eyes. Lightning cracked beyond the glass. The thunder followed a moment later, shaking the window like a breath catching in someone's throat. I didn't flinch. I was already inside the storm. The photo trembled in my hand and something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not angrily, quiet like a door unlocking. Behind me, Mino returned. Her steps stopped short at the threshold. I didn't look up. Hara, quietly. Why was this hidden? She didn't answer. I didn't expect her to. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. I placed the photo inside the album again, this time at the front. Then I closed the cover. And I knew. They didn't forget this birthday. They never meant to remember it. The photo album remained on the laundry table that night, its leather cover cold under the dim bulb, the edges still wet from where the rain snuck through the warped window frame. I hadn't touched it again. I didn't need to. That one photograph had burned itself into the back of my eyes. Every time I blinked, her arms were still around me. Even hours later, the weight of it hadn't lifted. It settled in my chest like a folded letter never sent. Upstairs, the house resumed its carefully composed rhythms. Forks clinked softly, slippers skimmed polished floors, distant music hummed like memory through the air vents. It was late, close to curfew, but something inside me refused to lie down. A restlessness in my limbs, sharp and electric, as if the air itself knew something I didn't yet. I wandered toward the main wing. The hallway outside the library was half lit by amber sconces. Rain streaked the tall glass windows, the thunder more distant now, as though it had moved on to haunt another part of the city. I paused at the corner of the corridor, where the walls bent around the spiral staircase. The familiar sound of hushed voices pricked at the edge of my hearing. I stepped closer. The door to the library was cracked open. Just slightly, enough for a whisper to slip out and find its way to me. Uncle Ha Xuan, voice low sharp. She has Hyun's defiance. That's what got her killed. I'm fractured. The syllables rang in my ears like broken glass clattering against tile. Hyun? The name struck the air with an intimacy I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know if I gasped or if the hallway simply forgot how to breathe. My hand slid against the wallpaper, steadying myself. They weren't talking about some distant cousin or a servant or a stranger. They were talking about her, the woman in the portrait, the one no one ever mentioned, the woman who held me with such calm, such certainty. In the photo, I still hadn't dared return to its hiding place. Ha-yoon? My mother. I leaned closer, drawn not by curiosity anymore, but by gravity. Auntie Sora, soft, uncertain. She looks too much like her, it unsettles the staff. To Uncle Howen. Then tell them to stop staring. She has no place among us. We agreed she would be raised quietly, without noise, without history. And Sora, that child doesn't ask questions, but she watches. She always has. Uncle Hazewan, coldly. Exactly, and watching is more dangerous than speaking. That's what her mother never understood. A pause, then the sound of a decanter being set down. Liquid poured. Ice clinked. Like tiny echoes of regret. Uncle Haywan. One scandal nearly cost us everything. We can't afford another. Their words faded behind the heme in my skull. I turned away, walking backward down the corridor like I was retracing someone else's footsteps. I didn't stop until I reached the linen closet near the staircase and sat down behind the door, knees pulled to my chest. Kayon. They said it so easily as if she were a warning, not a woman. She was brilliant. That's what got her erased. That night, I didn't sleep. My body lay still, but my mind unraveled every thread the house had spent years stitching over me. I retrieved a flashlight from the cleaning drawer, the small black one Mina used during outages. I pulled the records box from beneath the floorboard in the utility room, the one Mina told me never to touch. I touched it anyway. The papers inside were tightly packed. Official letters, billing statements, notes scribbled in the margins of an old journal. I spread them across the floor in rows, receipts that traced school payments back to accounts under names I'd never heard, a letter from the estate manager requesting silence in exchange for financial support, sealed copies of university documents bearing the name So Ha-yoon. My eyes paused on a document marked with an embossed seal, a thesis abstract. The title read, Inherited Power and the Collapse of Patriarchal Legality in Precedent Systems. Beneath it, in fading ink, her name. Her full name. Seo Ha-yoon. I didn't recognize my own breath anymore. Every line of that abstract read like rebellion disguised as scholarship. It wasn't theoretical, it was personal. Every case she challenged in her writing mirrored a rule I had lived beneath without knowing it. Every clause she disputed was a breath I'd swallowed instead of speaking. She hadn't disappeared. She had been deleted. They didn't bury her in the ground. They buried her in protocol. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world hung in a stillness so complete, even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. I looked around at the sea of documents surrounding me on the floor. This wasn't an accident. It was a structure, built plank by plank, lie by lie. She didn't vanish. She was removed. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere above me, a floorboard creaked. I froze, listening, unsure if it was Mina or a memory-made sound. I gathered the documents quickly and returned them to the box, sealing it with tape this time. I hid it behind the water heater where no one ever checked. Then I sat on the edge of the servant's cot, fingers digging into my palms, heart thudding against the silence. They spoke her name tonight, for the first time in years, and now that I had heard it, I could not let them forget it again. The air in the archive basement was heavier than I expected, thick with dust and the weight of forgotten things. My footsteps echoed against the concrete floor, each step slow, deliberate, as if my body knew I wasn't meant to be here but refused to turn back. The lights above buzzed faintly, a dull yellow flicker against walls lined with shelves that smelled of mold and bureaucracy. I moved past rows of steel drawers labeled with last names and submission numbers. Most were neat, categorized, untouched, but the drawer I'd come for was marked in pen, redacted archive, faculty code S13. The paint on the handle had chipped away. My hand hesitated before pulling. When I did, the drawer screeched open with a resistance that felt too alive. Inside, among a stack of rejected manuscripts and unsigned evaluations, sat a single manila folder sealed with a red cord. It wasn't labeled like the others. Instead, across the front, someone had handwritten, in capital letters, "Unbury submission, Hayu." The world narrowed around me. I slid the folder out with both hands and moved to the reading table under the nearest light. I could hear my pulse in my ears. The air carried a dryness that clung to my throat, but I didn't cough. I untied the cord and opened the file. Typed pages, slightly curled with time, sat before me. Margins lined with red pen, some comments scribbled in haste, others in contempt. My eyes scanned the first title page. Inherited Power and the Collapse of Patriarchal Legality in Precedent Systems, a Case-Based Critique. Author, Si-ha Yun. Faculty Advisor, redacted. I touched her name, and then I began to read. Her opening lines didn't whisper, they struck. Language that was precise, intelligent, unflinching. She had not written to be palatable, she had written to confront. With case law as her blade and lived experience as her shield, she dismantled legal frameworks, argued precedent against tradition, and questioned every unspoken rule I had grown up suffocating under. She was brilliant, audacious, alive on the page in ways they never allowed her to be in life. Her tone was not angry, yet every sentence carried resistance. She didn't raise her voice, she sharpened it. As I flipped to the second section, I noticed a page corner darkened at the edge, a faint burn mark that hadn't spread. I turned it carefully. A smell of singed paper rose faintly, and something colder moved through my spine. Someone had tried to destroy this. Red underlines littered the margins of her third case study. Notes like, dangerous implication, unacceptable bias, too radical for publication. But none of it discredited her work. If anything, it proved the threat she posed. And I knew, in the marrow of my bones, that this was the reason they silenced her. She had uncovered what they wanted buried. She had named what they insisted remain unnamed. And now I had it, in my hands, her voice, intact. My fingers gripped the edges too tightly. I eased them before the paper creased. A page near the back had a handwritten note clipped to it, its ink blurred from water damage. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, it means they failed to destroy all of it. I wrote this knowing it would cost me everything. I only hoped one day it might return to the hands that understand why. HYC. The room was quiet. Too quiet. I felt something shift inside me, not loud or explosive, but final. It wasn't sorrow that filled me, it wasn't grief, it was recognition. They had tried to burn her words because they knew she was right. I wiped at my cheek and realized I'd been crying. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time the tears didn't feel like defeat. They felt like alignment, like every part of me had just found its place. I gathered the thesis page by page, memorizing the page order, scanning it slowly with the small portable scanner I brought from the estate's office, originally used to catalog antique menus and wine labels. As each page blinked green on the scanner, it felt like lighting a candle. She hadn't died quietly. They killed her voice. Bellish resurrecting it. Somewhere above, a heavy door creaked open. I tensed, listening for footsteps. But they didn't come. I placed the original back in the folder, resealed it, and left it exactly where I found it. Let them think it was still buried. I would make the truth louder elsewhere. Back on the estate, the house was asleep. All lights dim, the hallway carpets absorbed my return like a secret. I went straight to my room. Not the servant's cot that I had grown up in, but the small private space they had given me once I passed the bar exam and became too visible to treat like a maid. Locked the door behind me, sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the blank document. Her words still echoed behind my eyes. Not the legal arguments, though I had memorized every one, but her note. To whoever finds this, I only hoped one day it might return to the hands that understand why. I understood. I understood now what they had tried to erase. And what I was meant to become if I stayed silent. The name on my ID badge read Han Min Seo. Clean, neutral, deferential, the kind of name that glides past scrutiny and leaves no ripples. It wasn't mine, but I wore it like armor. I walked into the Han Family Foundation headquarters on a Wednesday morning cloaked in winter sunlight. The building's facade shimmered with glass and intention, tall, modern, designed to impress donors who didn't look too closely at the cracks beneath the foundation. Inside, everything was white and soft gold. Receptionists smiled with eyes that flicked only once to my badge. I didn't need them to remember my face. The elevator ride to the 8th floor was quiet. No music, only the click of heels and the hush of tailored sleeves brushing against pressed wool. When the doors opened, I stepped into the executive floor like it belonged to someone else. Someone forgettable. That was the trick. If they remembered you, they'd ask who sent you. If they ignored you, you could write the speeches they'd recite on national television without ever being thanked. The conference room sat at the far end of the corridor. Frosted glass, polished table, 12 high-backed chairs, 11 filled. Yerin sat at the head. She wore a blazer 3 shades too pale for her skin, a glossy nude lip, and a smirk she hadn't earned. Her assistant hovered by her side, offering coffee she barely acknowledged. She looked up only once when I entered. Then her gaze slid off me like water over marble. "You," she said without lifting her chin. "Copy these notes before lunch. Don't screw it up." She slid a binder across the table. I caught it without flinching. Her words weren't cruel, they were careless. That was worse. I took the seat closest to the door, flipped open the binder, and began reading. The proposal inside was meant for a new education initiative. It was supposed to sound empowering, legacy, upliftment, opportunity. What I read instead was a half-baked arrangement of cliches and recycled talking points. Sentences bloated with self-congratulation, data misrepresented, quotes lifted from outdated sources. It wasn't just lazy, it was dangerous. She's using my mother's name to sell slogans that contradict everything she fought for. I adjusted my pen in hand, the same model Mina had once told me my mother preferred. Smooth ink, sleek casing, heavy in the grip. The pen didn't glide, it cut. I began editing, crossed out 3 lines on the first page, rewrote them in tighter phrasing, deleted a paragraph of unfounded claims, and replaced it with 2 sourced facts I remembered from Hyun's thesis. Yerin didn't notice. Her assistant glanced at me once, then away. The others in the room kept their attention on coffee, phones, gossip. None of them saw the quiet erasure happening beneath their own project. They never asked my name, so I wore the one they gave me, but every signature I fix, every clause I rewrite, it brings me closer to my real one. The meeting ended with polite applause and shallow affirmations. Yerin smiled as if she'd birthed something noble, as if the paper in her hands hadn't been rewritten line by a girl she couldn't be bothered to remember. As the room emptied, I lingered, gathering leftover documents. A few interns brushed past me, whispering about weekend plans, about Yerin's feature in a lifestyle magazine. Their words faded behind the sound of the pen cap clicking closed. Later that day, in the shared intern workspace, I received an email forwarded by Yerin's assistant. The subject read, "Incredible speech draft. Use this version." It was mine. She had attached the version I edited and signed it off as her own. No edits, no credit, no comment. I stared at the screen for a long time. It didn't surprise me, but it stung all the same. You've been here before, I reminded myself. You've lived beneath borrowed credit and watched them dress your silence in silk. This time, you're writing history from the inside. That evening, as I walked past the foundation's wall of portraits, photographs of family members who served on the board, I paused beneath the second frame. Hyun's picture wasn't there. It had never been. But I stood before the blank space between Uncle Juan and Aunt Sora and imagined her portrait hanging. Dark hair pulled back, chin slightly raised, eyes that didn't beg for approval. A nameplate beneath it. Seo Hyun, legal scholar, removed, not forgotten. I took a breath and moved on. In the elevator, I stood beside Yerin as we descended to the lobby. She didn't look at me. "New girl," she said idly, scrolling through her phone. "Make sure you wear heels tomorrow. Flats don't project confidence." I smiled faintly at the glass reflection between us. I'll wear the kind that lets me stand longer. She didn't hear me. Or maybe she chose not to. Outside, the cold air bit through my coat as I stepped onto the pavement. The wind carried the scent of early snow and exhaust fumes. I walked with purpose, my heels clicking against the stone like punctuation. They had never counted me among them, had never saved me a seat. But now I was in the room, editing their words, stitching my mother's fire into their fabric. And soon, they'd speak her name without knowing whose name they were honoring. The candle on my desk burned slowly, its wax inching down the stem like time folding into itself. Outside, the city was wrapped in winter hush. Traffic slowed by frost, windows glowing from behind sheer curtains, distant sirens echoing without urgency. My apartment, though modest, held the stillness of a courtroom. Every object in place, every drawer emptied and sorted. Nothing left to distract me from what had to be done. The scanned pages of my mother's thesis sat open on my screen, each line sharpened by a final round of editing. I had cross-checked citations, formatted footnotes, and written a foreword that didn't ask for sympathy, but demanded recognition. My laptop's glow was the only light in the room now. It made the keys beneath my fingers shimmer faintly, like they knew what I was about to do. You were brilliant, I thought, my gaze fixed on the name at the top of the document. They couldn't kill your words, so they buried them. I've dug them up, and now they'll breathe again. The cursor hovered over the button labeled Publish. I didn't flinch. I clicked, and then the silence cracked. It began quietly like all revolutions do. A few retweets, then dozens, then hundreds. Academics sharing excerpts with trembling admiration, students quoting paragraphs with hashtags Seo-hyun was right, erased scholar, daughter of silence. I watched her name rise through the trends like a resurrection. Hyun Seo, scholar, ghost, now legend. The first headline dropped before dawn. Who was Haeyoon Zo, the scholar the Han Foundation never acknowledged? By morning, 3 legal journals had reposted the thesis in full. By noon, reporters gathered outside the Han Foundation's building, mics extended towards spokespeople who had never once practiced denying the truth. A protest formed outside Seoul Women's Law School, signs held high. Restore her record. Truth doesn't need permission. We're her voice now. In every photo, Hyun's name appeared larger than it ever had in life. I sat on the floor of my apartment, back against the wall, knees drawn to my chest. The candle had long since gone out. My phone buzzed non-stop, but I didn't touch it. You were silenced for 18 years. They folded you into footnotes and whispers. Now the world reads you out loud. I pressed play on the national broadcast, an anchor with solemn eyes and a trembling voice reading excerpts from the thesis. To weaponize legality under the guise of tradition is to sentence progress to death by inheritance. Her words hit harder now, not because they were new, but because they had survived. My phone rang. I picked it up without checking the name. Erin shouting, "Are you insane?" I said, "Nothing." Yerim. "Take it down, this is defamation, it could destroy everything." She sounded more desperate than angry. The edge in her voice was too sharp for denial. Yerin, you think you're noble? You're blowing up years of peace. That scandal was settled, buried. You think it's brave digging up the past? Buried isn't the same as dead. I didn't answer. I wanted her to hear what silence felt like when it wasn't on her terms. Yerin, quieter now. If grandmother sees this, her health, she can't. A rustling in the background. Then another voice. Grandmother, off screen. Already has. Her voice was old and steady, a winter wind that had never lost its bite. The call ended. Later that night, I stood outside the estate gates. The iron bars loomed higher than they had when I was a child, but they didn't feel unreachable anymore. A black sedan was parked at the curb, engine running, waiting to ferry another executive home. From the shadows, I watched Yirin exit through the side door, scarf thrown carelessly over her shoulder, eyes darting left to right. A reporter stepped forward. Reporter. Miss Han, do you have a comment on the thesis? She paused, lips pressed together in a strained smile. Yareen. The Foundation supports truth, whatever that may look like. This is a family matter. No further comment. The door slammed behind her. She hadn't denied it. And that was enough. I walked away before she saw me, the cold wind wrapping around my coat. My feet moved slowly, deliberately, carrying the weight of something sacred. Back at my apartment, the petition had reached over 200,000 signatures. Calls to restore Hyun's academic record flooded the university's inbox. A letter signed by 17 professors demanded a public apology from the Hun Foundation. They called her the scholar who vanished. But she hadn't vanished. She had been waiting. The auditorium buzzed with a low, anticipatory hum. Chairs shifting, heels clicking, whispers weaving like thread between rows of polished wood. The stage had been polished that morning. I knew because I had walked it in silence, counting my steps from podium to curtain, memorizing the light angles, the height of the mic, the density of air when the house lights dimmed. I stood backstage now, hidden behind a velvet drape thick enough to muffle the breath in my throat. In my hand, my mother's journal, a small, leather-bound book with frayed corners and pages that smelled like ash and jasmine. She wrote in the margins when she was scared. Not facts, feelings, the parts she couldn't publish. I had marked the passage I would read tonight. The panel was titled Forgotten Women of Law, Voices That Were Silenced. Irony had a bitter aftertaste. None of them knew what was about to happen. Not the press, not the board, and especially not Yeren, who sat front row in a cream blazer too pristine for what was coming. The moderator introduced me by my legal name. Not the one I had been born with, not the one that would matter now. As I stepped onto the stage, a wash of light blinded me for a second. Then came the flashbulbs. The hush. 1,000 eyes blinking into stillness. My heels echoed once against the wood before I reached the microphone. I opened the journal. I cleared my throat and began. Hara saw. My name was erased, but not my work, not my daughter. Hae-yoon So, 2006. The silence snapped. It was sharp, stunned, the kind that clings to the ceiling before shattering into gasps. People shifted in their seats. A cough echoed from somewhere far off. Someone whispered my mother's name like it was holy and forbidden at once. I looked up slowly and let my gaze land on Yeren. She was frozen, pale. Her lips parted, the corners tight as if trying to force a smile back into place and failing. I continued. My mother wrote what the world wasn't ready to hear. They burned her words, buried her name, told me to carry silence like it was legacy. I refused. I could feel the room holding its breath. I am not here as a guest of the Han family. I am not here on behalf of the foundation. I am here in the name of a woman who wrote until her hands bled and still wasn't believed. I let the words hang, and then I closed the journal. Applause didn't come immediately. It rolled in slowly, like a tide pulled in by something ancient. Then it broke, loud and undeniable. Reporters stood, cameras zoomed, phones were raised, live streams launched. In that moment, I didn't flinch. I stepped away from the mic and left the stage. Backstage, the air was warmer, heavy with breath, the pulse of what had just passed through. Erin was already waiting. She pushed through the curtain, heels striking the floor like threats. Her cheeks were flushed, jaw locked. She smelled of expensive foundation and unraveling plans. Yeren, low trembling. How dare you turn this into your circus? I didn't answer right away. I wanted her to feel the silence this time, not as a shield, but as a weight. Hera, calmly, you were raised for the throne. I stepped forward, slow, measured. Laura, I was raised to burn the stage it sat on. She blinked. Yeren, you think this is justice? You think humiliating us fixes anything? Hera, it wasn't humiliation, it was correction. I held up the journal between us. Its leather spine caught the light like armor. Yara, you erased her name from your speeches. I carved it into your headlines. Her hand twitched, as if she wanted to grab it, snatch it, tear it. But she didn't move. Yaren, quietly. You don't know what this will cost you. I tilted my head, eyes steady. Era, I grew up in a house where breathing too loudly cost me a future. I've already paid, now I'm collecting. The door behind her creaked open. An intern peeked in, pale, eyes wide. Enter nervously. There's a crowd outside, they're chanting her name, Hayun. Yeren turned sharply, her composure fracturing at the edges. She left without another word. I stood in the wings for a long while after, the journal still warm in my hands. Outside the auditorium, people held signs. Some had printed her thesis on shirts, others wore pins, some cried, some smiled. They didn't know my face. But they knew hers now, and that was all I ever wanted. The air inside the estate hadn't changed. It still carried that polished quiet, the kind found in houses that measured love and reputation and history in curated silence. The faint scent of sandalwood clung to the baseboards, and the floors gleamed with the same waxed perfection I used to scrub on my knees. But today, the stillness didn't feel oppressive. Today, it felt like a stage already dismantled. The long dining room was empty. Chairs pushed in with rigid precision, the table dressed in an embroidered runner embroidered with golden cranes. Symbols of longevity, they used to say. How ironic. No one had survived this house the same. I walked across the room slowly, my heels muted by the thick carpet. The chandelier above me was lit, every bulb aglow, its crystals throwing gentle sparks against the ceiling. I looked up at it and remembered the first time I'd seen it, clutching a silver tray, too scared to breathe near its weight. I used to dust it with trembling hands, stretching on tiptoe to reach the edges. I scrubbed floors here once. I paused beneath its center. Today, I signed an order beneath this same ceiling. My hand brushed the folded contract in my coat pocket, the ink still fresh. The boardroom had gone silent when I'd read the title aloud. Seo Hayun Legal Fellowship for Girls in Law. A fund in her name, built from the money they had once used to erase her, funding a future for girls who speak too loudly for fragile rooms. On the wall, the portrait of my grandmother still hung, expression unchanging. Urines had been removed. The space beside it remained blank, the nail still in the wall. I didn't ask what happened to her picture. I didn't need to. The absence said enough. I moved toward the head of the table, at the chair where grandmother once sat, the one none of us dared to touch. I placed a folder. Inside it was a scanned copy of my mother's thesis, a signed letter from the university restoring her academic record, and a framed photo I had kept for years. The same one I found on my forgotten birthday. Her smile, my face, her arms around me like a promise the world tried to make her break. I placed it gently on the seat, turned the frame so it faced the chandelier. Then I reached into my bag and unfolded the last thing I'd kept hidden. The maid's apron. Clean, pressed, edges embroidered in soft beige. Mina had stitched a flower into the hem. Once. Quiet rebellion, unnoticed by the family. I held it in my hands for a long moment. This was the first uniform I wore. Not for work, for survival, for disguise. I folded it slowly, smoothing each edge with precision. My fingers didn't shake, my breath didn't hitch. This time, I wasn't hiding beneath it. I left it draped across the chair nearest the window, the same one I used to sit in when they let me eat near the table. I didn't need to burn it, its power had already been emptied. Footsteps approached from the hall, soft, slow. Mina appeared at the doorway, hands clasped in front of her, wearing the same quiet uniform she always had. Her eyes met mine. No words passed between us. I nodded. She nodded back. She had seen all of it, hidden most of it, carried more of it than I would ever know. She was never the villain in this story, she was the keeper of the wound. As I turned to leave, she stepped aside without question, without praise, without regret. I passed the staircase. The wall still bore the family photographs, updated after every major gala. My face had never been there. Until now. At the very end, in a smaller frame newly hung, was a photo from the panel. Me at the podium, Mother's journal in my hands, her words in the caption below. My name was erased, but not my work, not my daughter. They had printed it in bronze. Outside, the evening air had turned lavender, the sky streaked with the last light of winter sun. I stepped out into the garden and inhaled deeply. Somewhere behind me, that chandelier would flicker off for the night. The chairs would remain in place, the house would sleep. But it would never forget me again. Nor her. They thought her blood was a stain to be scrubbed away, but she wove it into a crown, forged in silence, worn in triumph, a legacy no lie could ever erase. So, all of our dear listeners, silence isn't always chosen, it's often inherited, and when the truth is buried long enough, uncovering it becomes an act of justice, not rebellion. Hara didn't set out to destroy anyone, she simply chose to stop accepting a life built on someone else's erasure. Her journey reminds us that reclaiming your identity starts the moment you stop apologizing for existing. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like your voice was overlooked because of where you came from or who others assumed you were? Tell us in the comments. And if this story made you feel seen, subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications.